Well, we can go ahead and get started. I know that there are some people that are out of town this week that said they would have to miss part 3, which that's okay. Graber will probably have these up online probably in the next couple, maybe 3 weeks. So I'll send an email to everyone who registered. If you didn't register, you can look for it here in a couple weeks if you happen to miss a class or something like that. But anyway, excited to finish up with you guys. Thanks for journeying with me in these 3 weeks. I hope it's been helpful. So let me pray and we'll get started. Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you that you are the word, the living word that came to dwell among us and be with us. We ask you, Father, that you would guide our time today, guide this teaching, and we ask that ultimately our ears, as just we reflected on this morning, our ears would be the ears that hear your voice, that we would be the sheep that understand your voice and know how to follow your voice and listen to your voice, that we would follow the way of truth and not follow the way of lies that ultimately lead to our destruction. And so we ask you, Father, to make the truth more clear to us this morning and for the rest of our lives, and that you get the glory from our journey. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, before we do any little quick review, if you were in first service, Lee, he actually mentioned hermeneutics a little bit, but there was another point of his sermon where he brought up something that I thought was a really good job of using the tools of interpretation that I didn't even think about going into it. But did anybody pick up on it where Lee spoke about a verse that's maybe often taken out of context and spoke to maybe the real context of it? Anybody pick up on it? Maybe. That was good. That was definitely like using the tools of the Greek. That expounded on it. It's in that same verse though, but it wasn't necessarily the abundant life piece that I feel like is often taken out of context. I feel like he clarified what that meant, but the thief. Yeah. That I was like, oh wow, that absolutely in context makes sense. That I don't think that Jesus was primarily talking about the devil here. I think he was primarily talking about the false religious leaders who refer back to Ezekiel 34, who were all about themselves and all about caring for themselves. I thought that was really interesting. And because if you pull John 10:10 out of context, like that description's like, oh, that fits the devil. And it does. But in that context, it actually increases the meaning to think about how these false religious leaders were only pleasing themselves and not actually caring for the sheep. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. So I learned something new from other people doing proper interpretation. So that was good. Okay, we'll do another quick review. What are the 3 layers of context that we need to look through when interpreting the Bible? Can y'all spout them out? Historical, cultural, yeah. Theological, and then one more. Literary, yes. If you do all 3 of those things, you can do it well by the Spirit of God guiding you in the process. You can interpret the scriptures well. So literary context being reading what's around it. So not just reading John 10:10, but reading all of John 10, and even before and after that. The historical cultural context being, Lee did a lot of that today too. Hey, here's what sheepfolds looked like. Here's what these shepherds did. Here's what the thieves would do. That's all the historical cultural context. As someone I've never taken care of sheep, it's helpful to know those things. It brings the scriptures to life, so to speak. And then the last one being the theological context. Speaking from a theological standpoint, what does it mean that Jesus is the shepherd? And how does that fall into the fold of the whole narrative? And what Lee did, tying it back to Ezekiel 34 and the comparison of the old shepherds of Israel and how Jesus is the new shepherd, that's the theological context that he was weaving in today's sermon as well. And so all of those are really necessary to interpret well. So we did this last week, but it's helpful to just relearn. Some quick review. The Bible is the collection of God's words given to mankind through history to reveal his nature and promises to redeem mankind through Jesus. And so that's ultimately what his words are. It's his words to his people in history. And then we can trust the Bible's historicity, canonization, translation, and ultimately its power that makes it stand out from any other written literature. The Bible is structured with different types of literature. Those types have different genres within them. We went through multiple of those genres last week. We'll go through more this week. Yet all of these genres tell one unified story. I think the most fascinating thing about the Bible is you think about the best stories that are ever written in, like, I don't know, Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis stuff or whatever, series that people love. It's all written by one author. And yet, from a human perspective, there's over 30 different people who wrote these scriptures, and they all tell one unified story. And it happened over a span of 2,000 plus years of the writings. Like, that's kind of crazy. Like, how no other story was written over that long of a period with those many authors that tell one unified story. It's because ultimately God is the one authoring it through these people. So, because it's a really cool story. Number 4, the foundation of interpretation is what we just said: literary, historical, cultural, and then theological context. And then number 5, there are multiple tools at our disposal to learn true context and interpret properly, which that's where, the thing on abundant life, we read abundant life and we don't, we get to decide what that means. And then reading it from the Greek language, it's like, oh, wow, this is like exceedingly excessive. Like, that's what that means. Really brings it to life. And then we just learned how to practice. So we've been doing that with different verses that get taken out of context and other passages. And so I'm excited to walk through some New Testament this week. Many people would say that the New Testament's easier to translate, or to interpret. I think the reason for that is that it feels like the historical cultural part is a little bit easier because you're not dealing with as much temple sacrifices and instructions of tabernacle and all those things. That being said, there's still a ton that we read from our own Western eyes. We read stuff maybe the way it wasn't intended to be read. And even specifically when we read the epistles, it's actually funny. If you pinpoint the most common verses that we talk about as American Christians, it's like Romans 12:1 and 2, and Philippians 4, 4 through 8 or whatever. It's all I can go on, Galatians 5 and 1 Corinthians 13. Almost every one of our favorite passages from each epistle is towards the very end, which that's where Paul gets practical. And because that's Americans, we love practical stuff. But the beauty really of the epistles is the beginning parts of it. And so, and really, if you were to ask Paul, hey, how do I be transformed by the renewing of my mind and not conform to the pattern of this world, Romans 12:1 and 2, he would say, well, read the first 11 chapters of Romans and that might help you. But we as Americans, we just jump straight to the end. But how do we see the theological context of what Paul is giving us, and that these instructions of love in 1 Corinthians 13 become a lot more powerful and beautiful when you understand it in the context of the church and the relationship and all that he's speaking into. And so anyway, I'm excited to dig into the New Testament a little bit. We're also going to touch on, so we'll do New Testament narrative, we'll do parables, we'll do epistles, and then we'll do apocalyptic literature, which also bleeds into the Old Testament a little bit as well. I won't be spending a ton of time on the apocalyptic because there's more questions than there are answers, which I think is the point. And ultimately, I don't want to walk out of here with debates. And so, but we will start with New Testament narrative. So this is going to be pretty similar to Old Testament narrative, which one of the things that we learned last week is that you can't just take every character as a role model, and you're not supposed to make the stories primarily about morals. Because, if Nehemiah is a great leader, then you're going to be ripping people's hair out when they're disobeying you, which probably isn't good. So, biblical characters, except for Jesus, always Jesus is the standard. You can learn from him. But the stories aren't primarily about roles and role models. I think one of the things that is new about New Testament narrative that you don't see as much in New Testament or Old Testament narrative is in the New Testament narrative, you're always looking for ways in which this requires that you understand the Old Testament, but you're looking for ways in which Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament narratives and the Old Testament prophecies. And so if you read John 10, like we did today in main service, and you've never understood Ezekiel 34, there's actually some passages in Jeremiah as well that speak and basically label the leaders of Israel as shepherds in a negative light. If you don't know that, then John 10 can still be powerful, just maybe not as powerful. And so you're always looking for the ways in which Jesus is fulfilling what's being spoken of in the Old Testament, because he does that. I actually had a friend in college who made it his goal that he wanted to underline in his Bible, every time that Jesus fulfilled an Old Testament word or prophecy or thing that was spoken about him. And he ended up underlining so much of it just through the first half of Matthew. He's like, I'm giving up. There's just so much. And but that's always a good thing to look through and notice. And then I think one of the keys that we often miss, because I think in a good way, we get so focused on Jesus, we can miss the tension that the authors are trying to put on us, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is they're trying to basically tell us that we have to respond to this Jesus guy. Like, as they're revealing who he is, we have to respond to who Jesus is. And so one of the things that the gospel authors do over and over again, if you've noticed it in John, you can see it, they're highlighting the response of the people. Always. They'll tell you what Jesus did and what he said, and then they'll tell you how everybody else responded to it. Because they're putting tension on us, how are we going to respond to this? So even in the passage today that Lee taught through, there's 19 verses of Jesus' dialogue, talking about him being the good shepherd, being the door, all these wonderful things. And then the last 2 verses, and so because of this, everybody was divided, and some people said he had a demon. And that's supposed to actually like matter to us, because then it puts tension on us. Either these words are true, and he is the good shepherd, and he does hold the path to life, or he's demon possessed. Like, it's that polarizing. There's no middle ground with Jesus. And so always looking for how are the people responding to Jesus and why. And then obviously looking for evidence of the new covenant and how that changes the narrative. What is different about the new covenant? What maybe was Israel getting wrong about the new covenant that Jesus has come to redeem and refine for us? And so those are all the things that you're always trying to look through. So let's do a little bit of practice. If you were there this Sunday, you're gonna understand a little bit. I'm using this passage because I taught through it. I think it was December or January, something like that. And so it's fresh on my mind. That's why it's easy to walk through in this one. But this is the story about the healing at the pool. So go ahead and go there in your Bibles if you haven't. But John 5, 1 through 15. So right off the bat, before you even get into reading it, when you hear about the story of Jesus healing the paralyzed man at the pool, what often is this passage used to communicate? Like, how is this passage often taught whenever you've been taught this passage? Like, what are some things that come to mind about this passage that you've been taught? Yeah, healing on the Sabbath. Yes. Yeah. So this is a passage about healing that's often used in healing stories or in healing sermons. Anything else that this is used for that you guys have heard? Even in that vein, I've heard this used before, which is kind of interesting, about the element of faith, and that, this old man got up and walked after Jesus said those words. And what's interesting is there's not really evidence that he had faith. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it looks like he doesn't, and that Jesus just speaks it. And so sometimes in Jesus' miracles, there's an element of faith involved, but in this one, it doesn't seem to be the case. And so how many of you have heard this? And maybe it's just me. I've even beyond healing, this is how I've heard it most. Almost like an evangelism teaching of like, hey, you can't save everybody and you can't help everybody, but who's the one person around the pool that you can go to and help and love? Because Jesus cares for the hurting, and he saw this man hurting for 30 years. And so we need to do the same. And again, we can't save everybody at the pool, but who's the one person? That's often how I've heard this taught, which again I'm not trying to take away from those things. That's really good advice, and I think has helped me in my life to understand that. But I don't think that John wrote this passage as like an evangelism, like how to help people tool. I think he wrote it to highlight something different. And so we'll look at this passage real quick. I'm going to read it for us, and then just kind of pull some things here that can be really helpful. So again, as I'm reading this, look for all the 3 different contexts, which again, I'm not going to be able to read all of John, but we've been studying it, so maybe you're in it a little bit. And then look for the literary context, what's happening from beginning to end, and then see how it ties in to the whole picture of everything. Okay, so let me read this. It's hard to hold a clicker, a Bible, and a microphone at the same time. All right, John 5, 1 through 15. After this, a Jewish festival took place. So that's something to note, historical, cultural context. What would be happening there? And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. By the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there's a pool called Bethesda in Aramaic, which has 5 colonnades. Within these lay a large number of the disabled, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been disabled for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the disabled man answered, "I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me." "Get up," Jesus told him, "pick up your mat and walk." Instantly the man got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. Now that day was the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "This is the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat." He replied, "The man who made me well told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who is this man who told you, 'Pick up your mat and walk'?" they asked. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. After this, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you." The man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. Therefore, the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. So, just from a pure reading standpoint, one of the things that you always want to pinpoint is, why did John write this? And why did God, through the Spirit, prompt John to write this? And almost always, one of the things that you can pinpoint is if a therefore is there. And so we get that all the way in verse 16, which usually when this is taught, that's why I cut it off at 15. Usually when it's taught, they won't even say verse 16, because that's not how we think of it in our unstoried American culture. We just love the story of a healing. But for John, this mattered in the whole big picture of things, because this was the beginning of Jesus' persecution. So the whole point of this passage, the whole reason why John has this in here primarily is to highlight this is why the Jews wanted to kill him. Okay? And it ultimately boiled down to, if you ask that question, okay, why? Is it because he healed a man? No. Is it, I could say all sorts of other things, but why did they want to kill him? Broke the Sabbath, right? Now, think back to Nehemiah 13, the passage that we talked about last week. Why was Nehemiah ripping people's hair out? They're breaking the Sabbath, right? And so this thought, which again, kind of rightfully so. Why was Nehemiah so mad that people were ripping people's hair out? Why was he so mad that he was doing that on the Sabbath? Why was he so mad he was ripping people's hair out about the Sabbath? Why did that make him so mad? What did you say? Yeah, they weren't being faithful. And ultimately, what happened to Israel in the history of Israel whenever they broke the Sabbath? Yeah, they got sent in exile. So all of this matters and all of this connects. So you actually understand from the Pharisees' standpoint why they're so mad and why at this point there's like 40 extra laws surrounding the Sabbath when Jesus is living, because they're so adamant, we got to observe the Sabbath correctly, because otherwise something bad is going to happen again. And so that's the context that we jump into. But Jesus is rewriting a different narrative. And he's knowingly, Jesus is Jesus, he's smart. He knows that there's a festival going on. He knows it's a Sabbath. And he knows that this pool is right next to the temple, and he's going to be able to make a big scene if he heals this man and tells him to specifically, the healing wasn't the problem primarily. It was that he told him to pick up his mat and walk, which was one of the rules of the new rules of the Sabbath. And so Jesus is doing all of this for a very specific reason, because he's wanting to stir the waters, punny, metaphorically, right? Stir the waters of religiosity and say, I've come to set in tone a new covenant and set you free from this covenant that's ultimately leading you to destruction. And so, again, in John 10, when he says the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, it's like, oh, the thief are those Pharisees that, whether intentional or not, they're robbing people of a free life in Jesus by all these religious rules and instructions. And Jesus is coming to set us free from those things. And so that's ultimately the purpose of this, is that Jesus has come to set us free from this law of sin and death, where because of sin, this law was put into place that ultimately became a burden for us, not because the law was wrong. We are flawed and we can't fulfill that law. And so we needed someone to come and rescue us from both the law and sin, which ultimately sin leads to death. And so this man's crippling was a resemblance of death. That's why in the Old Testament you were considered unclean if you had an open wound, because it's something that resembles death. It's something that resembles blood and the loss of life. And so the ailment of the body resembled death. And so Jesus is coming to not only do away with death, but do away with the sin that leads to death and do away with the law that came because of sin. And all of that is encompassed in this story for Jesus to say, I am the one that's come to set you free from the law of sin and death. And there is life in me, and what you think is, isn't. And so that's why it was ruffling the feathers of the Jews. And so beyond healing and beyond how to care for those who are hurting and beyond an evangelism tool, this passage is about Jesus coming to rescue us from the law of sin and death. And how all of those connections from the Old Testament, speaking about the law and this, this death that's looming for all these people, Jesus is coming to rescue us from those things. And so that's just ultimately what we're trying to look at and look for in these stories. And so, again, with any New Testament narrative, a lot of what you're going to find in the Gospels and the book of Acts is a lot of narrative. And it's just always looking for the context, trying to understand what's going on. And why does this matter? Even in the book of Acts, my assignment that I had to do in my class was actually centered on Acts, not necessarily the Gospels. And often in the book of Acts, how we read it is we read the church as this perfect thing in the book of Acts. And it's like, oh, this is the model church. And I don't think that that's necessarily true, especially if you read the Corinthian letters and you're like, oh, actually, there's a lot of problems. But what you're trying to recognize and look for is how God's hand is continuing to be with the church in the midst of all of its flaws, and that it's advancing regardless. And the fact that Paul and, Peter, Paul and John Mark and Barnabas, there was conflict amongst all the leaders. Surprise, surprise. Has that ever happened? Conflict amongst religious leaders, and yet still the gospel's advancing. There was racism, there was neglect, there was all sorts of things in the early church, and yet it still was advancing. There was persecution, and yet it's still advancing. There was false teaching, and yet it's still advancing. Someone said the other day, the fact that the church primarily around the world existed under pretty horrific Catholic leadership for hundreds of years and yet still survived through it all is pretty astounding. Pretty astounding that something like that would be able to survive and be redeemed. It's only by the grace of God. And so just having that perspective now when I read through Acts is just different, because I'm just looking for how God's hand was on it the whole time. And there's even all these passages where Paul's like, I wanted to go here and the Lord didn't make it happen. And I didn't want to go here and I ended up here. How the Lord was the one guiding and leading his church the whole time. And so anyway, just fascinating stuff from New Testament narrative. So hopefully that's helpful. Now we're going to get to New Testament parables. And this is the one I gave you guys some homework on. I said to read the one of the prodigal son. So parables are meant to be read a little bit differently because they're not literal, right? So when we read narrative, we can know that literally these things happened. But when we read parables, we're reading a story, right? Jesus is telling a story and he's doing it for a reason. And so often what we do, again, this is how we think as Americans, we take that little story and we pull it out of its context and we try and teach from it and learn some morals from it. And that's not necessarily the point or the goal. Every one of these parables was said in a specific context for a specific reason. And so we have to know that. So every character matters in this story of a parable. And the reason is, which goes to point 2, every character resembles some person that's represented in that time. So, and typically it's the religious leaders are represented. Typically God is represented. And typically those who are oppressed or broken or hurting are also represented. And so you're always looking for who is who in the story. Who is Jesus trying to say, you're this person and you're this person, without directly saying it, right? Who's he implying? And then every character matters. So where does every character start? Where does every character finish? That's one of the things you're always looking through. Where does each character start? Where does each character finish? And then again, you're always trying to notice the responses from the audience. Sometimes when Jesus tells a parable, the Pharisees are mad, like really mad, because they know that when Jesus just told this story, he implied that they're the bad guy in the story. And so they walk away mad. And so we have to understand, like, who is Jesus connecting to in this story? And then every aspect of a parable has a spiritual counterpart. This is where you have to get a little bit careful. It's true, but you have to get a little bit careful. We can over-spiritualize things, and yet at the same time, these stories are meant to make these connections that are not literal, that are more spiritual. And so that was always one of the things that my professor said over and over again is like, there is a spiritual counterpart to every piece of this, but be careful of over-spiritualizing. So take that for what you will. That was hard advice for me to follow. He said I did it a couple times. But so we're gonna focus in on the parable of the prodigal son. And so hopefully you did your homework. But just right off the bat, what is the story of the prodigal son usually focused on? If there's any teaching on the prodigal son that you've heard, what's kind of like the primary walkaway or the thing that you get drawn into? Aaliyah?
The redemption arc where like this
Yeah.
kid who left a hold of the home,
Yeah.
did a bunch of bad things,
Yep.
came back, but realized he needed his father and his family.
Yes.
Came back, changed his life around, his dad was so happy for him.
Yep.
But it was not. And then
Yep.
just like there's this redemption arc.
Yeah.
You walk with you always wait for that.
Yes. I love this redemption arc. I love the way that you put that because you're putting it in story form, right? There's this redemption arc. We call it the parable of the prodigal son because it's about this son who was lost and realized his broken ways, and he realized he needed his dad again. He turned back and he came back and he changed his life around. That's absolutely, I think, the primary way we often hear this heard and taught. That's good. Thank you. What's maybe a second way you've heard the focus of this parable on? That's definitely number one. That's primary. I would say number two would be the emphasis on the older brother, who was the religious. It gets labeled as the Pharisee type in this story, right? The religious one who's upset at people's redemption, who doesn't think that certain people deserve grace and mercy and blah, blah, blah. And so that's often another thing that's emphasized in the story as like a teaching point and a teaching moment, which again, I would say amen to both of those things. There's truth to each of those because again, you're focusing on this son, you're focusing on this son. But the interesting thing is the whole point of this parable is not primarily about either of the sons. It's primarily about the father. And so Kevin did a great job when he taught on this a couple of years ago. He like relabeled it prodigal father, which doesn't really make sense because the father wasn't lost, but he had the prodigal son. But ultimately the story is about the father and about how the father relates to each son, both in their own ways of dysfunction. And so, but the reason why this is helpful, so for those of you who did your homework, what comes right before the prodigal son passage? The lost coin? Yep. And the lost sheep. Okay. Do you think that the lost coin and the lost sheep, that the emphasis is on the coin or the sheep? No. It's on the person who finds the coin and on the shepherd who goes and looks for the sheep, right? It's not, the reason why the lost coin doesn't get taught is because it's hard for us to relate to a coin. But as Americans, we love to relate. And so I love, in my sin and my brokenness, I was the son, which definitely there's this progression. When you go from a coin to a sheep to a son, Jesus is intensifying the metaphor, right? But if the emphasis at the beginning was on the person who lost the coin, and then the person who lost the sheep, and then the father who lost the son, the emphasis is on the person who had this possession and lost it, rather than the possession itself. But we read ourselves into the story so much. We want to be that prodigal son that gets this moment of redemption, this party thrown for us. But the emphasis needs to be on the father. And then other context, who is the audience that's around when Jesus is teaching these things? Sorry, what was that? Sinners. Yes. And Pharisees. So Jesus, he was basically being rebuked for hanging out with the tax collectors and sinners, hanging out with the worst of society, right? And so these religious leaders are rebuking him. How dare you hang out with these people? And Jesus comes in and he goes, well, let me tell you some stories. So imagine you have a coin, you lose it between the couch. And obviously a coin back then was, say you lost $1,000 in today's money. And you were freaking out. You didn't know where it was. And all of a sudden you find it and you go and you tell all your friends, I found the $1,000. I found it. Like you'd be so happy, so ecstatic, right? And then this sheep, you have this one sheep that gets lost. Of course the shepherd's like, I can't just let the sheep go astray. I'm going to put the other 99 in this fold and I'm going to go chase after this one and go capture it and bring it back. And then you have this son who squandered everything. And the father threw this giant party to welcome. It's just the emphasis is on the father's response to what's lost and ultimately the owner's response to what's lost, which ultimately gets to a much bigger meaning. And so the other thing that's helpful in this, so that's just literary context right there. That's literary context. That we just did is what was said before this, what was going on before this, how does this relate? The prodigal son is connected to the other two stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin. So already, okay, there's something that's been lost by an owner, and the emphasis is on the owner recapturing that possession. Okay? So that's just literary context, and ultimately that possession being the broken people of society. You have the tax collectors, which obviously they represent the prodigal son. And you have the Pharisees, who are the audience, and they represent the older brother who's kind of the religious type that are upset at the redemption of other people. But from a historical cultural context, let's think about this. So if you go to Luke 15, again, I'm going to try and do this one-handed. So let's go to Luke 15. So we're looking at the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. I'm just going to read the first few verses. It says, a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So the father distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. Already right there, we read this and we're like, oh man, this son took his father's stuff and went and lived a rough lifestyle. And we kind of pity him to a degree. But let's think about this. Imagine if you're old enough to have a decent sum of wealth that maybe could be left behind as an inheritance, think about it from that perspective. If you're young enough that you don't have much wealth, but you know that your parents have something at least, imagine doing this. Imagine your child, or you as the child, going to your parents saying, hey, I want all of my inheritance now. And then the parent complying and saying, okay, so I throw out an arbitrary number. Let's just say your share of all the estate, all the home and everything, let's just say, give 100,000 to this kid, 100,000 to this kid. There it is, go. And then a week later, he just leaves the family. The child does, or you as the child, you leave the family completely. And then you head off to Vegas and you squander it all. You put it all on black and it was red. It didn't work out for you and you lost everything and you're living in debauchery. And then all of a sudden there's an economic crisis that hits as well. It says a famine struck the land. He had nothing, major, a virus hits the world, or 0809 crisis. Something happens. And all of a sudden, not only have you lost everything that could be really useful in a time of famine, you have no way to gain anything back. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're homeless on the side of the road. You have nothing. Years pass. Thinking about this from our perspective, do you think your parents would be pretty upset if you decided to take half their money and then run and leave and never talk to them again and squander it all? Whew. And then from a parent's perspective, could you imagine the pain from the parents to say, I loved you and trusted you enough to go ahead and give you half of this ahead of time. Half of my estate. I gave you your inheritance and you just left me. The pain from a parent's perspective. Okay. So you're already there a little bit emotionally. Now, this is from a 21st century American mindset. Now, as best as you can, put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Eastern context that is so family oriented, so communal oriented, this is like, you deserve to die. I mean, the reason why it is so scary for Muslims to finally get to the point of accepting Jesus is because they know two options are pretty much available for them if they accept Jesus. One is I get found out and someone comes for me and kills me or kills my family. Or two, my family disowns me and I never see them again. That's how communal Eastern cultures are. That's how important the family is. And specifically to disrespect the patriarch of the family by taking all of this estate, all of this money and wealth, and squandering and leaving the family business, leaving everything aside, is unthinkable and unspeakable that someone would do this. So it makes total sense why the other brother would be like, are you kidding me? I've been working in the family business. I was trustworthy with the inheritance. This person runs away for years, squanders everything, and you're just going to welcome him back? He dishonored the family more than anybody's ever dishonored this family. And Father, he dishonored you more than he's ever dishonored anybody, more than you've ever been dishonored by anybody. Like, that's the weight of this story on like a deep, deep familial drama level, like drama out the wazoo. So it's supposed to evoke some of that in us that like, whoa, this is worst of the worst, and you have this faithful brother over here, and this is the redemption that the Father offers? And so that's historical cultural context that brings the weight of this story in a little bit deeper of like, wow, this is unheard of for someone to rebel against their family in this way and then to be brought back into the fold without any sort of, especially the idea of penance and the idea of like earning your way back into something is definitely an Eastern way of thinking through things. And the son, he approaches it from that perspective, like, let me work, give me the worst job, but please, can I just be around you guys? Give me the worst job. And the father's like, you're not a hired worker for me. You're my son. That idea is like, wait, he doesn't have to earn his way back. Like, it's just mind-blowing for all the audience. Both the tax collectors and the Pharisees would be mind-blown at this story. So that's just historical cultural context that provides some weight on this. And then let's think about this theologically from the grand story. Right? This is a pretty powerful passage where you talk about a God who, did he trust humans with inheritance? Yeah. Everything I have is yours. You see this whole earth? You see these animals? See these trees? This water? It's all yours. In fact, I'll let you even name it. You get to name every creature, Adam. Go ahead, name it. All right? You get to tend it, cultivate, work the ground. This is everything that's mine is yours. The only thing you can't touch is that one tree right there. But if it's mine, it is yours because we get to work in this family business together. And like the prodigal son, we went off and squandered it. All right? Each of us in our own heart, and then Adam and Eve physically doing that. And that's the world that we've been born into, is we're living in this broken world of Vegas, this broken state of famine, and we have nothing to offer. Absolutely nothing. And not only do we have nothing to offer, we have wholly dishonored the name of God in every form and fashion. Internally, externally, with our corrupt thoughts, with our deceitful hearts, with our brutal actions, we have dishonored the name of the Father. We bear his name and we bear no resemblance in our human flesh. We have dishonored the Father. We've left the family business. And yet, he is willing to celebrate and throw us the most magnificent party at our return and have no penance for us. No sense of you need to earn your way back into favor with me. That's the type of God that we have. That's the type of God that we serve. And not only that, I think what's also just as incredibly powerful in this story is you look at the father's response to the older son. Does the father get angry at the older son and rebuke him? No. What does he say? Everything I have is yours. And it's been yours this whole time. So come, let's celebrate. You're not losing anything by your other son being here. All I have is yours, and I just want you to share in this inheritance together with your long-lost brothers and sisters. And just this picture, this is the type of God that we have, who loves the most religious jerk of all time and the most sinful heathen of all time. He wraps both of them in and says, all I have is yours, and I don't care if you squandered it, or I don't care if you've been faithful. I am willing to throw you the biggest party of all time, and we're going to enjoy this together. So just trust in me. Come join me in the celebration. So we should walk away from this story just in awe that we have a God who has that much mercy and that much grace and has that much abundance that we actually get to share in and that he wants to. I think the most fascinating part of the story is like, if I'm a father and my son, and I don't know how old these sons were in the story, but if my girls are in college and they come to me and said, hey, Dad, I want half my inheritance, or I want all my inheritance now. So give half to my sister, give half to me. I'd be like, no, you're not ready for that. No, I'll give you an allowance, but like, I'm not going to give you everything now. And I don't see any debate, and maybe, I don't know, but like just in this story, you just see the father's desire to trust and share and enjoy everything with his children. And so ultimately we ought to walk away from this being like, wow, this is the God that we serve. That no matter how bad Israel is, both in its religious debauchery and in its sinful debauchery, God is willing to throw a party and celebrate his children who trust in him and share in his inheritance. And so, yes, can we learn something from the prodigal son? Absolutely. Yes, can we learn something from the older son who's the more religiously angry type? Yes. But our primary walk away ought to be, wow, we serve a God who desperately loves his people and wants to rescue them out of anything. And he's willing to do that. And he's willing to restore us back to what we had in the garden. And that he's going to share with us everything. And we'll get to live in eternal pleasures of all that he has. And that what was said of the older son, that everything I have is yours, will be said of us in the eternal kingdom. That everything of the kingdom is ours. Like that it just ought to draw us into this worship and this awe of our own rescuing, but primarily the type of God that we serve and worship. So hopefully that's helpful. And again, all these parables can kind of speak to the same thing. You're going to find in the parables too a big theme of the kingdom. It's going to be often used a lot because the Israelites understood the concept of a kingdom. We don't. We're America. We broke free from the kingdom, So, but you're going to find that theme a lot. And so just trying to, as best as you can, trying to put yourself in the perspective of someone who understood the context of a kingdom and a king, and trying to put yourself in a little bit more of a patriarchal, familial society, because we don't necessarily live in that a ton in America, but that's how they would have read these stories and understood these stories. And so it becomes a lot more powerful when you read it in that context of this son did something that was basically putting his own family to death, and the family would have wanted to put him to death. It just puts things in perspective more. So hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully you can kind of see from this with every parable, every character represents somebody, and you're always trying to look for where did this character start, where did this character finish. So with the tax collectors and the sinners who are represented in the story, they started off as God's beloved, but then squandered it and rebelled. But then returned to the Lord, and then were completely received in full joy and pleasure without any sort of penance that was due for them. All right, so that ought to teach us something. And then for the Pharisees who are represented in the story, they start out under God's fold and remain faithful in their work, but they don't match the Father's heart. They don't carry the same heart that the Father does. But yet even then, we end the story with this invitation to share an eternal joy and inheritance with the Father. And so we don't even end with an rebuke. We don't end with them being cast away. We end with an invitation for the Pharisees. And so Jesus is ending this story, extending an invitation to the Pharisees to say, hey, your heart is different than the Father's, but there's still an invitation to come and enjoy what you think is yours. And so again, that ought to teach us how Jesus is trying to relate to the Pharisees, because he's not, yes, there's a rebuke here, but he's trying to extend an invitation to them, saying, hey, look at the joy of the Father when the Father receives something that's been lost, and recognize that you're lost too in a way. But there's an invitation to share in this joy and this inheritance from the Father. So hopefully that's helpful. Now we're going to jump to the epistles, and I'll give you some time to work on this one yourself. So all of the epistles, the word epistle just means letter. So hopefully that's helpful. All of the epistles are a letter written from a person, and sometimes there were multiple people kind of helping contribute. Like Paul sometimes would have Silas or Timothy with him as he's writing these. But they're written to a specific audience. And again, audience is really, really important. The context of the audience is really important. So take, for example, sometimes Paul is writing to one person, and sometimes he's writing to a whole church. There's probably a difference in how we should read that if that's the case. If that makes sense. Sometimes we know the person, and sometimes we don't. 2 John is written to the lady. I don't know who the lady is, but it's a lady. And so as much as you can know about who the audience is helpful. And so author, audience, time and history, even speak it like, the time and history, there's a lot of stuff about Nero and the Roman Empire and all this stuff that can be really helpful context around the times of these epistles that can be helpful. So commentaries are really, really helpful. Even a study Bible, like Angel, I think you mentioned that you had one. They'll give you really good context of, hey, here's what Ephesus was like around this time. And all the things you can learn about Ephesus are actually really helpful tools. And then notice the discourse of the overall letter. Oh yeah, early churches are not meant to be model churches. We've said that multiple times. But then notice the discourse of the overall letter. So again, which is so good to go micro, but in the midst of going micro, don't lose the macro, if that makes sense. All right, so we typically, like even how we're doing through John, we're going small bits of passage at a time, especially when you go through epistles because they're so meaty. If you teach a sermon on Ephesians, sometimes you'll go 5 verses at a time, basically. But you don't want to lose the overall narrative of what Paul's trying to write in the midst of going so narrow. Okay? So, even whenever you're reading, and if you have like a devotional that maybe is like, hey, read Ephesians 3 today. That's great. Read Ephesians 3. But as best as you can, try and just capture the overall trajectory of what Paul's trying to write and why he's trying to write it, because it'll make Ephesians 3 come to life a little bit more than it already has. So, what we're going to do is we're going to study a verse that I think does often get taken out of context, and I'll let you guys do some research, whether in your study Bible, you can use Google, and then we'll talk about the importance and the weight of this verse after. So, it's 1 Timothy 4:12, the classic youth ministry verse, right? Don't let God look down on you because you're young. Set an example for the other believers in your speech and your conduct and all of these things. And so I'll let you guys do some digging work. So I'll give you guys the next 4 or 5 minutes. Go ahead and look in your study Bible. Again, look for literary context. So what has said around this one verse. Look for the historical cultural context. Who is Timothy? Where is he? What's happening with him? And then look for the theological context. Why is this important in the overall narrative of Scripture? Okay, so we'll tackle all 3 of those. I'll give you guys 4 minutes. Go. Okay, so let's share it together, do some practice together. So hopefully you got some bits and pieces, and together we can fill in everything. So pure literary context. Obviously, Paul is writing to Timothy. We don't have to ask that. Where is Timothy? Ephesus. Okay. What is Paul's primary purpose of writing to Timothy? Sorry, what was that? Yes. Well, so he's writing to Timothy to instruct him as he's leading the church, and obviously some of those things will end up being shared with the church for sure. But Timothy's a pastor, right? A pastor of this church. And so Paul is writing to Timothy to encourage him as a pastor and to challenge him and to say, hey, here's some things that can be helpful in your church. Here's some, what are some things that First Timothy starts off with? Like, what What is Paul writing about? Is he writing, I don't know. Yeah, what is he writing about? What was that? His what? Union? Youth. Okay. Yes. Not to be intimidated. Right. So the first few chapters of Timothy, what is he emphasizing a lot of?
False teachers versus good leaders.
Yes, false teachers versus good leaders. And he's trying to encourage Timothy to be a leader for his church. And so over and over again, he's basically, First Timothy can be summed up as in like church instruction and then like motivation to combat false teaching is like kind of really the only two themes that are really there. And so Paul is speaking this to Timothy. And we can also tell from literary context, you would have to know this from the book of Acts. But how did Paul and Timothy meet? How old was Timothy when Paul met Timothy? It's okay if you don't know. Take a guess. Sorta. Yeah, like 16. Yeah. 14 to 16 is where they predict. Kind of at the age where he's ready to leave his household, but young. As best as we know, apparently his mother had faith. Father don't know much about. He was half Jewish, half Gentile, or something like that. So, so Timothy then started just journeying with Paul and just did tons of ministry with Paul. But if you track it based off of the time in which this was written, which this is a historical cultural, we don't know this from just the Bible, but when was this written? Anybody got the date or approximate date? Yeah, AD 64. Mine said 63. So somewhere around that time, right? So sometime in the mid 60s. And that was approximately about 15 years after Paul first met Timothy. So was Timothy a 16-year-old when he received this letter? No, even though we often emphasize this verse for the 16-year-olds, right? But he's older than me. I'm 29, so he'd probably have been like 31 or 32 when he received this letter. And he's pastoring a church. And so already, like, oh, there's some weight here that maybe I didn't often see. Like I read this verse and I'm like, oh, that's for teenagers, that's for the junior hires and whatever. And not that there's something that they can't learn from this, but how many 30-something-year-old pastors probably need to be encouraged in the same way Timothy did and maybe miss it because they think that this passage is, it just contextually, it's like, oh, that's the teenage passage. No, this is for like 30-something-year-olds who are trying. And so that's just pure, some literary context that can be really, really helpful in this. There's a lot of false teachings. There's disorder in the church because obviously for any church to be less than like 15 or 20 years old, and there's no precedent ever, you're just starting this thing off the ground, there's bound to be some disorder. There's bound to be confusion. Not everybody was able to walk around with 10 different versions of a Bible. Half the scriptures of the New Testament weren't necessarily even written yet. So a lot of disorder, a lot of false teachings, a lot of confusion. Makes sense, okay? What are some things to know about Ephesus? What was Ephesus like? Because that's where Timothy was pastoring. I maybe just gave that away. That was going to be a question. Timothy's pastoring in Ephesus. What's Ephesus like? Anybody know some things about Ephesus?
It's kind of crazy.
Kind of crazy.
A lot of sin going on.
Uh-huh.
The Temple of Artemis is there.
Yep. What's the Temple of Artemis about? What was she the goddess of? Fertility. Is basically an orgy temple is one way to think about it. Yeah.
There was a lot of sacrifice going on.
Yep.
Warring between people.
Yeah. If anybody has a map and you can see Ephesus on the map, it's a port city, so it's right on the water in a really strategic area of the Mediterranean. Very wealthy for its time, and not only that, have the Temple of Artemis. Like, it's not a stretch to say that out of all the Roman Empire, it was kind of like the Vegas of the Roman Empire. Okay, so now all of a sudden you're Timothy. You've walked with Paul for 15 years, and now this guy who mentored you is not there, not present with you. You're in Ephesus, which is a really difficult city. It's basically the Vegas of its time. It's super wealthy. There's a lot of influential people in Ephesus, and there's a lot of sin and destruction in Ephesus. And all of a sudden, you're this outsider that's coming in, that's trying to teach these people and trying to lead this church when there is no precedent for order. And there's a lot of other people who are wealthier than you and more influential than you in this city, and probably some people who are older than you in this church. Do you think that Timothy was probably struggling to lead confidently? Yeah. One of the most quoted verses from the Timothy epistles is 2 Timothy 1:7. Can somebody quote it? Anybody know it? God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of and love and self-control. Do you think there's a reason that Paul wrote that specifically to Timothy? Right? I think probably he was struggling with some timidity and some fear, given his situation. Paul also encouraged Timothy to drink something. Anybody know what he was encouraged to drink? Wine. Why? Yeah, his stomach. What causes your stomach to be uneasy? Stress and anxiety. Right? It kind of makes sense. It's like all coming full picture. Like, oh, wow. I'm just imagining Timothy. Like, this isn't a perfect example, but like, just imagining some 30-something, like a 30-year-old, someone like me, about my age, trying to go plant a church in a place that's really difficult, like Boulder, Colorado or something. And it's just like, it's rough. And your mentor is miles away. You don't get to see him. And you're already maybe a little bit more of an introverted type. And next thing you know, you're in this city where people despise you, people hate you. And the few people that are in your church, over half of them are older than you. And it's full of pretty wealthy and influential people that kind of think they know what they're doing. It would be so easy to just be like, okay, just kind of like, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't want to fail as a past. Like, just sure, the great idea, person. Let's go with that. Like, and Paul is just trying to say over and over again to Timothy in both of his letters, like, you can do it. You've got this. Remember the Spirit of God, and remember that we prayed on you. We laid hands on you. The faith that you had when you were young. Remember these things. Remember all that we've been through. You can do this. I'm challenging you. Stand up to these false teachers. Don't let them take over this church. Right? Like over and over again, Paul, you just feel this like fatherly love towards his 30-year-old pastor that's just like, don't give up. You know, there's all these statistics today from Barna about how many pastors like actually want to quit their job, and it's like 40% actually want to quit their job, they just don't, and that like increased significantly over the pandemic and all these things, and because pastoring got difficult when a bunch of political mess got involved and all sorts of other stuff. And so if that's true today, in a relatively somewhat comparatively easy American context, especially in the South, there's a gazillion churches in Fayetteville, like if it's hard for pastors now, imagine how difficult it was for Timothy and how often he probably thought on a daily basis, should I just bounce and do something different? Like, is this really, like, am I the person for this job? Like, maybe it's only people like Paul, which Paul, I imagine, very bold personality, very not afraid of confrontation, right? Pretty outgoing, pretty courageous. And maybe Timothy was a little bit different. And he's probably looking at this and he's thinking like, I don't know if I'm the man for this job. And so Paul is just over and over again, don't let other people look down on you because you're young. And even if they're more influential, even if they're wealthier, and even if they're older than you are the one who's called for this role. You are the one that we laid hands on and prayed over. You can do this by the Spirit of God in you. Like that's what he's trying to say to him over and over again. And so for us, this ought to be a really good passage for us. Even if we're not a pastor, right? Most of us can't directly relate. I'm probably the closest to this, but even then, I can't directly relate. I'm not a head pastor, and I'm not in a place like Ephesus. I have a relatively easy environment at New Heights. And so, but even still, we can learn from this to say, man, the times in which we're going to be confronted with a world that is opposed to what we're doing, and when the world wants to gain influence over the Christian world, specifically the church, we as a church ought to stand up in confidence and push back on that. But primarily, I think the application for us, who are the Timothys of today and how can we support them? Knowing that this is what they're going through. And so Paul says, don't let others look down on you because you're young. How can we as the church not look down on our pastors because of whatever reason it may be? But how can we come alongside and support them specifically, which there's all sorts of research that's being done? People my age are less and less and less likely to become pastors because of the culture that's around. And so for people like me and our generation, it's like the most terrifying thing is to offend somebody. And to be in a pastoral role is to like basically be canceled by half the society at this point. And that's scary for people my age, and especially even younger. And so more and more people in the millennial and Gen Z generation are fleeing from the church leadership roles. They'll still go to church, but they're fleeing from those leadership roles. And there's this kind of this expectation of crisis that's going to happen in the next 20 years when who's going to take over? And so how can we come alongside and support these young pastors, these young Timothys who are going to be facing some tough times as the culture continues to progress? And how can we not look down on them because they're young, but come alongside them and follow them? All right, it would be another helpful application for us. So that youth ministry verse just came alive a lot more, right? It's like, whoa, this carries more weight. Now, can a 12-year-old learn from this? Absolutely. But I don't want the 30-year-old that needs to learn from this to miss it because it's normally applied to the 12-year-old. If that makes sense. So that's an epistle, an example of an epistle. There's so much richness in the epistles. Look for the communal sense, especially with the letters written to Ephesus. It's not written to one person in Ephesus. It's written to the whole church of Philippi, the whole church of Colossae, the whole church of Corinth. So recognizing those things, because often, again, we read those as individuals and we think of them as individuals, but they were communal commands and letters. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. We're going to end now with the apocalyptic literature. And again, won't go crazy deep into this, but apocalyptic basically just means revelatory. It means that something's being revealed. When we hear the word apocalypse, we just think of like bombs dropping from the sky and everything burning. But really, it just means revelatory. So God is trying to reveal something through apocalyptic literature. That's why, the book of Revelation is called Revelation, because something was revealed to John about the future. It's mostly in Revelation. There are some in the Old Testament. I think of Daniel that comes to mind. There's some chapters in Daniel that kind of speak to the second coming of Christ in the end times. Jesus references it a few times, but primarily the most amount of picture that you're going to get is from Revelation. You're going to have to use tools. And I am not a primary tool that you should use. The more I read Revelation, the more I realize I don't know. And so use tools. There is so much Old Testament imagery in Revelation. It's crazy, even more than Hebrews. If you read Hebrews and you're confused, it's even worse in Revelation. There's so much Old Testament imagery. And if you don't understand it, you're going to miss the meaning. But here's what I would say, what I found to be the most helpful from my professor. The primary goal, if you look at the intent of the writings of apocalyptic literature, is not for us to figure out and solve a mystery. And I love mysteries. I love puzzles. That's not the goal. The goal is not to give us clues so that we can solve the mystery. The goal is to reveal to us that God is going to take care of us and God will finish what he started. That's the goal. So the intent for the reader is that we would walk away from this with comfort and hope. Which is funny and ironic because primarily when you think about apocalyptic literature, you think about walking away kind of scared and kind of like, oh no, like, oh, what's going to happen? This like, end times, rapture, all this stuff. But the intent actually is for us to walk away. Okay, God, you are going to finish what you started. You promised certain things and you will fulfill those things. And I have an eternity that I can look forward to. And regardless of what happens around me, I can trust that. Okay, so that's just some helpful, that was helpful for me because I reread Revelation now from that perspective and it's a lot easier. So then, ask yourself, how does this text build up hope and comfort? Because that's the intent, right? It was written for the body of believers to have hope and comfort in the times of trial that are ahead. So I put a little handout. If you guys still have the handout, if you don't, I have extra copies here. But I put a handout in there that kind of describes the 4 different views. There's multiple ways to look at it. There's 4 theories, like preterist and futurist and idealist and historist. And then there's like a handout that gives you a map. Show you. I don't believe I have it on the screen. No, I don't. But basically, it just kind of gives you the different views of all the things. And if theologians for centuries have argued on this and narrowed it down to 4 views and don't know, it's safe to say that we don't know And that's okay. And that maybe the point wasn't for us to know. Even Jesus himself said that he didn't even know the time and day when the end would come, that only the Father knew. So take that for whatever you want. But even Jesus says he doesn't know when the end is going to come. But basically, there's 4 views on the end times. And basically, the bulk of it comes down to how literal do you take the 1,000 years, the 1,000-year reign, and then how literal do you take other elements of Revelation? Is it metaphorical? Is it literal? I would say if you're looking at this, the majority, if not all of our staff falls into either a post-millennial or amillennial viewpoint on the end times. Neither, I don't think there's anybody on staff. There's maybe 1 or 2, but I doubt anybody on staff is premillennialism, which those would be the people who take the 1,000-year reign very literally, and would take the idea of a rapture more literally. And so, but the difference between a premillennial and an amillennial view is basically that a premillennial view is that the 1,000 years is a metaphorical time frame, but that the world will continually look more like the heavens as time goes on, and then the end will come in. So almost like the church's job is to literally bring heaven to earth, like actually, and kind of make earth more like heaven over time and more like the kingdom and usher in the kingdom, and then the end will draw near. So that's one way to view it. And the amillennial view is kind of a little bit opposite, where we agree that we think the 1,000-year reign is a little bit more metaphorical, but that the earth will just look a little bit worse over time and actually move a little bit more towards destruction over time, and then the end will draw near. And so where both can agree is that both agree that the church progresses in its advancement of the kingdom. It's just how that plays out in the world. There's a difference of, will it look better over time or will it look worse over time? But that's an easy one to disagree on and get along with as staff. And so, and there's probably a little bit of both. Like, I think that's fair to say that in some ways the world will look worse and in some ways the world will look better before Jesus comes. And so, anyway, so hopefully that's helpful. Beyond that, we'll do this exercise. So we're going to read these 6 verses together, and then I'll make a couple comments and let y'all go. So flip to Revelation 11, 1 through 6. This is actually one of the passages that comes under a lot of scrutiny in terms of how you interpret it. Do you interpret it literally or metaphorically? But without getting into that debate, we're going to ask ourselves, where's the hope and comfort in this? Okay? So Revelation 11, 1 through 6. So John, in the midst of this revelation, says, "Then I was given a measuring reed like a rod with these words, 'Go and measure the temple of God and the altar, and count those who worship there. Don't exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, dressed in sackcloth,'" which that's the same thing as 42 months. "These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone wants to harm them, fire comes from their mouth and consumes their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. They have authority to close up the sky so that it does not rain during the days of their prophecy. They also have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every plague whenever they want." Sounds fun. So you're like, okay, what in the world are we supposed to take from this? Obviously, and we don't have time, but there's a lot of context before and after this that could be really helpful to dig into. I think one of the most helpful contexts is this is in between the 6th and the 7th trumpet. So this is towards the end, if this is in chronological order, which there's an if there. But that could be helpful context. But anybody notice something, like tons of Old Testament imagery, by the way. You have temple, you have rod, you have reed, you have altar, you have all these things, olive tree, all these things. And then the 2 witnesses. What do we think about the 2 witnesses? Who might those be? Or maybe what was some things that were said about the 2 witnesses that kind of make you think of other people in the Bible? Elijah. Yeah. Calling down rain from heaven, right? This drought that lasted for years, and all of a sudden Elijah calls down rain from heaven. Yeah, that's something that Elijah can do. He can also call down fire from heaven. Who else is also mentioned kind of by metaphor? Moses. Yeah, turn water to blood, the plagues. So you have examples. There's 2 examples of Elijah and 2 examples of Moses that are mentioned in this passage that could in some ways be the two witnesses. And who was up with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Moses and Elijah. So you have Moses and Elijah kind of representing the priest, prophet, leader type of role, kind of that cared for Israel and led Israel and spoke to Israel on behalf of God in the midst of their time of two different ages. And they're the witnesses. And now, are they literally the witnesses, or are there people that kind of rise up similar to Moses and Elijah? Again, that's where all the debate is, and we don't fully know. But regardless of the debate, and there's another debate of, is this 3.5 years literal? Is the trampling of the temple in the holy city of Jerusalem, is that literal or is it metaphorical? There's all sorts of debate. I mean, much of the debate around Revelation. Anything that mentions Israel, is that supposed to be the church now, or is that literally Israel? And there's all sorts of different views wherever you fall in line with that. Regardless, because we're not going to solve this in this room, we would debate for hours. What can we take away from this? There's obviously opposition, right? And the opposition is allowed to do something for this 3.5 year period, whether literal or metaphorical. The opposition is allowed to kind of take its course. But then what happens to the opposition? What'd you say? Yeah. God's going to strike them down, right? These two witnesses are going to help cover and protect, right? And the evil will not prevail. So I leave this with more questions than answers, and I leave this comforted knowing that God's going to take care of us, right? I don't fully understand everything. I don't fully understand, is this a literal temple or a metaphorical temple? Is this Israel or is this the church? Is this actually Moses and Elijah, or are they other two witnesses? And who's, when it says the nations are trampling them, are those the spiritual rulers that rule over the nations, or are those like literally nations? I don't know. I don't know the answer to all those questions. But what I do know is that God promises to take care of us, to take care of his church. He says the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. And he also says and promises to restore his people, including Israel, and that the enemy will not finish this war in victory, but he will. And so I can see elements of that in this passage, and I can walk away both confused and comforted, and I think that's okay. And so the hope for us is to walk away from all of the apocalyptic literature, understanding, okay, God, I don't maybe fully see it, I don't fully understand it, but I trust you. And I can see how in all of these metaphors and all these examples and all these things that you are with us and you promise to not let us fall to destruction. And so I can trust in that. And I can trust that whatever trials or hardships, I can trust that when war is happening in Israel and there's all these bombs happening in the Middle East, I can trust that when culture is going sideways and going crazy, I don't have to fear. You're the one who authors this, and you're the one who promises to protect and persevere your church. So I can just trust in you and remain faithful in your church. And if the church can survive through hundreds of years of horrible Catholic leadership, then, hey, we'll be just okay. We'll be fine. Your spirit is continuing to live in and breathe in your church. And so that's just helpful for us to know. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys. We'll end with just a quick word. When I started this class, I said, my journey through hermeneutics and biblical interpretation just left me with these 3 words, that the Bible is necessary for me, that I'm hopeful as I read it, that I'll continue to get life from it, and that I can continue to discover. That every time I read the Bible, God's words are going to pierce me in a new way, over and over again, that I'll be sitting there in church and Lee says something and I'm like, I've never considered the thief to be the Pharisees. I've always thought it was the devil, So just things like that I'm just continually learning. And so I hope that is the same for you, that you're able to approach the Bible with humility and with confidence and with this attitude that you're going to learn and that you're going to discover more things as it goes on. And so let me pray for you guys. And then if you have questions, you can stay. Otherwise, I'm going to bounce because we got a college picnic at Wilson Park, which I'm excited about. So, Father, thank you so much for all these people in this room, and thank you even for the people that they're connected to, and for those who couldn't make it to all 3 weeks. God, we just ask that the things that we've learned wouldn't just be head knowledge, but that ultimately more and more, God, we would continue to be the type of sheep who hear your voice and respond accordingly, that we don't look in the mirror and forget who we are as we walk away, but we would trust that your words hold the power of life in them. Your words spoke existence into creation, and your words will finish the battle. Your words will finish the eternal war that has been going on, and your words will usher us into eternal paradise. And so may we cling unto your words, may we trust in your words, and may we know that only your words can be relied upon in this life. And so may the words that we speak match yours, and may our actions be modeled after your words as well, Father. Teach us to understand your word from your perspective. Help us in our gaps where we miss things, where we misread things, we misunderstand things. And Father, we ask that your Spirit would guide us into all truth and sanctify us by that truth for your glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you, guys.